Evening, everybody. Welcome to the first of our lay community talks for St. Benedict week. It's wonderful to see so many people here on a hot Friday evening. What else would you do? Well, although I gather that it's rainy in some parts of the country, it's still hot in the south. The lay community, for those of you who do not know us, is a community that was founded in 1971 by the monks of Worth Abbey in Sussex. We are a community of 230 people, mainly across the UK, although one of our members is in Oklahoma, who's joining us tonight from the 4th of July, USA. And we are lay-led, ecumenical, intergenerational, and an inclusive community. We pray together 4 times a day, and we meet up twice a year as a whole community. So on behalf of all of the community, can I say a huge welcome to you all tonight, and I hope that you really enjoy this evening's talk. And I'm going to pass over now to Michael Woodward, who is going to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Charles Insley.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you for joining us, Charlie. I'll just start with a few credentials before going down a sort of personal line of approach, if I may. So, Charlie has written extensively on early English and Welsh history, some fascinating titles you'll find in his back catalogue and recordings. Recently co-edited a book on gender, memory, and documentary culture, and he's the author of a forthcoming biography of King Athelstan, I know one of his long-standing favourites, and that's going to be published by Routledge. And so just going back a little way, he's been an important figure in the community and friend to me. After a break from events in the community, I was quickly aware the torch had passed, if you like, to the next generation. And meeting Charlie and appreciating his qualities filled me with confidence for our future. Because here was someone, I think at the time, playing the Mr. Easter role, not an easy one, and well able to overcome barriers often seen as problematic. And it wasn't that the confirmed Anglican Charlie was evidently in a flourishing relationship with the Catholic Liz. We were used to those connections in our community of unity by then. No, it was a sight of an East Midlands man getting close to a Yorkshire woman, clearly with no recourse to treaties or scrolls or affidavits, just natural charm and diplomacy. Charlie has this great instinct and flair for communities, I think, and impressive is the ground he's covered, leaving the dreaming spires of Oxenford to explore and apply his research skills in Exeter, North Wales, and Northampton. And if that wasn't enough, he was then prepared to launch a raid south of the Thames on Canterbury, all the while keeping fed his roots in railways, the outdoors, and cricket. Our conversations with Charlie are always fascinating as he makes connections and responses to my often very naive questions. But we've touched on the subject this evening before, and Charles nearly talked to us on this very subject, but was forestalled by I think illness, and it was a bit of a shame, and we were concerned about you, Charlie. But great to see you looking so healthy this evening, even if you are in the cellar. So I'm so looking forward to hearing what you're going to put before us this evening. So you are so welcome. You know you're among friends, so please relax. And
Thanks, Mike. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. So yeah, I've given lots of talks before, but never to this particular audience. So this is breaking new ground for me. So be gentle. So let's see if this works. Oh dear. Slides are not moving on. Let's try again.
Highlight the top line. Then click on the top line. That's right. It should click on now.
Brilliant. Thank you, Peter. It's our tech wizard on hand as ever. So the Rule of St Benedict and the making of the English state. So I want to take us back over 1,000 years to the 10th century. And I want to do a couple of things. First of all, I need to set the background. I'm assuming no prior knowledge of the things I'm talking about. So if you do have prior knowledge, I apologize, but hopefully this will all be comprehensible. So I want to talk about two things, and really the late 10th century is a moment where these two things come into contact in, I think, really fundamental ways, which is the so-called monastic reform movement of the 10th century and the processes that make a single English kingdom, what we call here the English state. And there's two moments in particular I want to focus on in that period, which I'll talk about: the Council of Winchester and something called the Regularis Concordia, of which more later, and then the second coronation of King Edgar, who ruled England between 959 and 975, his second coronation in 973. And then I find that obviously endlessly fascinating and interesting, but you might be thinking, well, yeah, and so what? And then I want to do that, so what? And think about, well, what are the implications of this? Why does this actually matter to us as inhabitants of Great Britain, as Benedictines, and just generally think about why this matters. So we're going back 1,000 years, but we're going to start by not going back nearly as far. So some of you may have watched this live on television. This is the coronation of King Charles III just a little over 2 years ago in May 2023. And there is King Charles surrounded by bishops and archbishops, etc. Now, there's the British do lots of things quite well, but the one thing the British do really well is pomp and circumstance. We excel at this. But is this simply an attractive and telegenic, if archaic, piece of theatre? Does this really mean anything? Does all this pomp and ceremony really mean anything? Does it have any relevance today, in other words? Well, I would say it does. I would point out to you that the coronation ordo used for King Charles's coronation draws directly on the coronation ordo that was used, probably was composed for the second coronation of King Edgar in 973. So there's a direct line between the events of May 2023 and the events of May 973. The same liturgy, the same prayers, the same invocations were used. So it's worth thinking, I think, about a bit about the context behind the composition of Edgar's, or the second coronation ordo, if it was indeed, as I think it was, used for King Edgar's coronation, and why that coronation matters. And there, just to kind of, I suppose, ram home the point, there is King Charles flanked by bishops, and there is King Edgar flanked by bishops, in kind of quite similar poses, but 1,050 years apart. So let's start almost at the beginning. I think the one thing I don't have to do for this community is talk about the origins of Benedictine monasticism, which is quite nice to not have to do that. What we do need to note is that from the late 7th century, we see monasticism introduced into England, foundation of various monastic houses across southern and central and indeed northern England. Wearmouth Jarrow, the home of Bede, who you can see there on the image, founded by a Northumbrian nobleman called Biscop, who took the name Benedict. No accident, surely. And that introduction of monasticism in England was influenced by both Irish and continental European kind of examples and practice, and Benedict kind of imports a mixture of Irish and continental European customs and practices. And the point is, I suppose, at this point, there is no, we might talk about Benedictine monasticism, but there's actually quite a lot of flavors of Benedictine monasticism in the early medieval West, quite a lot of flavors of monasticism, full stop. the narrative, or the sort of received wisdom narrative, then goes that this is all very well, and then the Vikings bring this to a crashing halt in the 9th and or the 9th century. Viking raids destroyed English houses. We know that Weymouth and Jarrow, Lindisfarne, was attacked in 793, and that this leads to both the loss of books, of monastic treasures, but also the decay of monastic life in England. What some historians call secularization of the monastic, both churches and monastic land. Alfred the Great, writing in his introduction to the pastoral, his translation of Gregor the Great's Pastoral Care, talks about that by his time, he's writing in maybe 880, barely anyone in England could conjugate Latin verbs, decline Latin text. And the standards of Latin learning were so bad that he needed to translate important texts into English. Now, I think more recently we recognise that to an extent Alfred was perhaps a little bit guilty of exaggeration. There's plenty of evidence of good quality Latin learning in 9th century England, especially in the Midlands. But this is the narrative that becomes quite embedded. And we see this playing forward into the 10th century. So I've noticed, I put here on the slide, Carolingian monastic reform. So there's a process of monastic reform in the Carolingian world, so the empire of Charlemagne. So really what we're talking about is modern France, Germany, northern Italy, bits of Spain. Where again, there's an attempt to consolidate monastic practice, to raise standards of monastic life, standardize, for instance, scripts used in monastic houses. And that has an influence on the early 10th century English church. The ripples of those reforms in the 9th century and going into the early 10th century, they ripple out into England. And the traditional narrative here goes that reform takes place in England in the 960s and 970s. And it's really about reviving monastic life. The monastic life has decayed so much in England, it needs to be revived. And the big three, as I've called them here, St Dunstan, St Ethelwald and St Oswald, are the kind of triumvirate that reform the English monastic church. I think it's inevitably, this is the kind of standard historian's response, isn't it? It's more complicated than that. It is more complicated than that. What happens in these reform moments is really much more, it's much less clear cut. There is no hard and fast distinction between monastic and non-monastic in this world. The same Old English word, which gives us the modern English word minster, so the Old English word Münster, is used of both what we would think of as monasteries as we understand them today, but also what we would think of as more secular churches served by priests but not ordained, but not claustrated monks. So the term is a very elastic term. So monasticism itself is a kind of elastic kind of category in this period. So what goes on in the 960s and 970s is a complex interplay of attempts to impose a kind of standardized practice on English houses, but also it's about the relationship between lay and clerical society, especially monastic society, about property, the lands owned by the monastic church, and about royal power. The relationship between, and I think it's critical in the period we're looking at, the relationship between royal power and these monastic churches. And that kind of brings me on to my next point, which is about England, the English state, as I've called it here. Now, this is a really complicated process, but very, very simply, very crudely, the 10th century sees the creation of a single English kingdom covering most of, but not all of, what we might think of as the English-speaking lands in Britain. And broadly, it kind of is the same shape as modern England today. It starts in the southwest, heads up through the Midlands, takes in East Anglia, and gets a bit fuzzy. sort of in the area around Hadrian's Wall. That bit sort of is no one really knows who owns it until probably the 12th century. But it's a kingdom that looks broadly like the England that we live in today. Two kings in particular are important for this process. King Athelstan, who, as Mike noted, is a particular favourite of mine, who ruled between 924 and 939, and his nephew, Edgar, who ruled between 957 and 975. And Athelstan is the first king to be called by his contemporaries King of the English, Rex Anglorum. Now, what's important just to note is that we're not talking about England here. We're talking about the English. We're talking about people, not places. But the nature of Athelstan's kingdom is very patchy in what you might call its heartland, in what was then Wessex, so essentially central southern England, and the West Midlands, Western Mercia. He was powerful, but outside of those zones, in East Anglia, in the North Midlands, and in what had been the ancient kingdom of Northumbria, he's much more of a kind of overlord figure. There is no, what do I mean by overlord figure? I mean that his power was mediated through relationships with powerful men on the ground, with powerful local men, not through institutions, not through the legal system, not through other kind of, not through tax raising, things that we kind of assume are normative for royal power. It's a personal lordship, not institutional. But that institutionalization follows. So, as I've said here on the slide, shift from overlordship to more structured power institutions. So, and that shift towards, you know, a legal system that works across England, towards kind of common coinage, towards tax raising, takes place in the second half of the 10th century, really during the reign of Edgar. And this is why I think Edgar's reign is so important here. What Edgar does is he takes this kind of idea of a kingship of the English that Athelstan has kind of developed and tried to make real, and turn it into something real, where he can intervene in local justice in the Midlands or the North. He can tax, and a key part of that institutionalization is the church. In particular, is the monastic church. So that his reign sees, as I say, this period of that we think of as the Reform, the Benedictine Reform, but it sees, you know, extensive royal patronage of particular monastic houses outside of, as well as inside, the kind of core zone of the English kingdom. So outside of the south and the southwest Midlands. So these houses, which are in receipt of royal patronage, these places like Burton Abbey, Ramsey, Ely, Thorney, Crowland, these places in the kind of in East Anglia and the Fens, become part of the way in which English royal power is projected outside of that heartland zone. So these royally connected monasteries are really important. But don't get me wrong, Athelstan's reign is still important in incubating some of these developments in England. So his court in the 920s and 930s functions effectively as a nursery for some of these clerics who become really important later on. Dunstan in particular and Ethelwold are both young men at Athelstan's court. And his court is an astonishingly, really, I don't know what image you have in your mind of what the court of an Anglo-Saxon king looks like, but Athelstan's court is really cosmopolitan. Irish abbots, Norse poets, Frankish, i.e. French, German, Spanish clerics are present at this court, Breton exiles. So this is a place where people and ideas and manuscripts are kind of circulating and meeting. The Rule of St Benedict is first translated into Old English, so the language being spoken by the non-clerical population, probably by Ethelwald. We don't know for certain, but probably by Ethelwald in the 940s. And the image I've got there on the screen is a script that we call Caroline Minuscule, which essentially is the ancestor of Times New Roman. This is the script developed in those Carolingian, those houses connected to Charlemagne and his sons, as a kind of common script for the dissemination of learning. And the earliest examples of this in England come from Brittany, and probably this script is introduced into English monastic houses in Athelstan's reign through the circulation of books. So Athelstan's reign is a foundational moment in the evolution of kind of monastic ideas, monastic reform in England. So let's think about, let's get down to the kind of nitty-gritty, the important moments. So the reign of Edgar himself, 959 to 975. First of all, Edgar had a very strong relationship with Ethelwald, St. Ethelwald, as he becomes. It's very likely that Ethelwald had been Edgar's tutor when Edgar was a boy. Edgar appointed Ethelwald, one of the first episcopal appointments Edgar makes in 963 is he appoints Ethelwald to the hugely important bishopric of Winchester. So in our heads, we probably think England, yes, Archbishop of Canterbury, Archbishop of York. And that's true to a point, but weirdly, in the 10th century, Canterbury it's not a backwater, but it's not the most important church in southern England, arguably. That church or those churches are the old and new minsters in Winchester and the Nunna Minster. So the houses founded by Alfred the Great, or founded or refounded by Alfred the Great and his children in the late 9th, early 10th century. So appointing Ethelwald to Winchester is appointing him to the most dynastically important monastery, or important church, sorry, in England. Ethelwald had been Abbot of Abingdon since the 950s and had begun to reform Abingdon along the lines of the houses that Ethelwald had visited in the 940s and early 950s on the continent. There is, I'll talk about this in a little while, but there is a very strong continental connection to this, that the key agents of monastic reform in England had all spent time in some of these reformed houses in essentially what had been the central part of the Carolingian Empire, Burgundy, in other words. So places like Fleury and Gortz in particular seem to have had a really profound influence on the flavour of monasticism that we see evolving in England. And Ethelwald loses no time in reforming both the old and the new minsters in Winchester, and makes a great play of expelling the secular clergy and replacing them with monks. So these are churches that had been founded as monasteries, or were believed to have been founded as monasteries, but the clerics there were not leading a monastic life. And Ethelwald described his actions as having driven away the wanton clerks. So there's a kind of narrative being played out here that the secular clergy are corrupt, prone to vice, and not leading an appropriately religious life, and that this needs to be reformed. Now that there's again, there's exaggeration going on, I think, a little bit here. What we know about reform in the late 10th century is refracted through a series of saints' lives, so a series of texts written about our holy men, written about Dunstan and Ethelwald and Oswald, which kind of constructs them as these great champions of monastic virtue in the face of kind of corrupt and venal secular clerks. Again, I'm sure that the reality is much more muddy than that. So we have Ethelwald reforming the old and new minsters, and in 966 he secures a privilege, a charter of privileges from King Edgar, So giving the new minster free election of its abbot, confirming its rule, etc. And this is the frontispiece of that charter. And I know I'm a victim for these things, but it's a stunning piece of English art. We don't have a huge amount of pre-1100 English art, and this is one of the most spectacular pieces of it. And here we see in the bottom of the picture Edgar, his arms and his head uplifted to Christ. In his left hand is the charter itself, so it's a kind of the charter in the charter. To his left is Queen Elfrith, to his right Ethelwold. Above him, Christ enthroned. And the image of Christ in majesty is becoming a very popular way of presenting Christ in the 10th century in England and in continental Europe. But I just love this. I could just gaze at this all day. It's truly beautiful, even here on a not very big screen. It's a really spectacular piece of art. And I'll come back to this in a moment. But one thing I would say is what's interesting here is the way in which the framing of this juxtaposes earthly and heavenly hierarchies. Edgar, the king, prostrate, I think, uplift with his arms and his head uplifted. Above him, the kind of heavenly hierarchy, Christ enthroned in majesty. So earthly and heavenly hierarchies are being kind of put in contact here. So this is followed, so that's 966. This is followed at some point, probably not long before, or maybe even in 970, by a council, a royal council with bishops, archbishops, abbots, but also secular figures, so ealdormen, earls, as we might call them later, and important lay magnates, lay lords. And the product is a text known as the Regularis Concordia. And it is what it says on the tin. It's a consolidated rule for all English monastic houses. So it takes, the core of it is that Rule of St Benedict, that translation that Ethelwold had done maybe Ethelwold had done in the 940s. And it expands it. It includes, she'll talk about in a moment. But it's designed to be applied or used by all English houses. So it's this kind of alignment of the making of a kingdom, the consolidation of a kingdom, and the consolidation of the rule in its monastic houses. Both of these things, if you like, overseen by Edgar. And again, the image that I've got there and the image I used to start the talk is from the frontispiece of the Regularis Concordia, with Edgar flanked by Dunstan and Ethelwold. It's based on continental Benedictine houses. In particular, I said those of the rules of used in Gorta and Fleury. And this is what the preface to the Regularis says. And so with their minds anchored firmly on the ordinances of the rule, to avoid all dissension, lest differing ways of observing the customs of one rule and one country should bring their holy conversation into disrepute. So there's a very clear alignment here between the notion of a consolidated rule for one monastic church and one kingdom. So the sort of sense in which the rule, the consolidated rule, has a very political dimension to it, I think is really clear in this preface. So it is a political statement as well as a kind of religious or spiritual statement. And we have a number of surviving manuscripts of the Regularis. We know it's disseminated to English houses. So very. So it talks about, for instance, the shape of the office. It talks about the liturgy. It talks about the nature of regular life, of monastic life. So it does say it takes the Rule of St Benedict, unpacks it a little bit, adds in things like prayers to be said for the king and the queen, and repackages it as a consolidated rule for English houses. I say mandated, so mandate psalms to be said for the souls of King Edgar and Queen Elfrith. The election of abbots happens with royal consent. Elfrith is singled out as a special patroness of nunneries. So almost Edgar's being kind of cast as a protector of monastic houses or houses of men, and his queen as protector of houses of women. And as I say, it is a strongly political text. We tend to look at it as a monastic text, as an ecclesiastical text, but it is also, I think, a much more political and maybe even social text. It's not just about monastic customs, but I think in some senses is a kind of vision for a holy society. This is a vision of what England should be in the 970s. This is why I think those royally connected houses, as I could term, those houses that are closely connected to Edgar or to Ethelwold or to Dunstan, are so important in the processes that make an English kingdom, because they are kind of surrogate royal presences. Places like Ely, as I say, Thorney, Crowland, Burton Abbey in Derbyshire. These places functions as kind of surrogate, or almost virtual representatives of King Edgar, as well as beacons of monastic life. So we move on to the coronation of 973. And strikingly, I hadn't really kind of clocked this until I was actually doing this talk, which is Edgar's second coronation is on the 11th of May, 973. Charles III's coronation was on the 6th of May, 2023. So almost exactly 1,050 years, but separate the two events. I don't know. I just, the synchronicity of that kind of struck me. It takes place in Bath. Now we don't really know what Bath might have looked or felt like in the 10th century, but undoubtedly quite a lot of the Roman fabric was still standing. So some historians have seen this as an imperial coronation. This is Edgar being crowned as a kind of Emperor of Britain figure amidst the remains of the last imperial presence in Britain, the Romans. Now, there's a really interesting question. Why does Edgar need a second coronation? So if we go back a little bit, Edgar had succeeded his brother Eadwy the kingdom had been split in 957. Eadwy becomes king of England or king of the English in 955, but that kingdom is split between Eadwy and his brother Edgar in 957, with Eadwy as king of the English, but Edgar as king of the Mercians, so the Midlands, if you like. And then Eadwy dies in 959, and Edgar becomes king of all the English. And we assume some kind of king-making ceremony, some kind of king-making occasion took place in 959. So why, 14 years later, does he need another coronation? Really interesting question. And I think it's for a variety of reasons. First is that probably a few weeks after this coronation in Bath, Edgar holds another assembly at Chester, where he meets all the other kings in Britain, so the kings of Strathclyde, the kings of Scots, probably the Welsh kings, so the kings of Gwynedd, the Haybarth and Gwent, quite possibly the Northumbrian rulers of Bamburgh. Any of you who've watched The Last Kingdom and have wondered at the career of Uchtred, Uchtred's family, the Earls of Bamburgh, are kind of quasi-kings in Northumbria. So he holds this great assembly at Chester within weeks of this imperial coronation. So I think these two things are connected. But also I think we need to see this coronation in relation to that earlier council at Winchester and that refoundation of the new Minster. This is Edgar effectively refashioning his kingship, I think. This is Edgar launching a new kingship post the Regularis Concordia, So a kingship which is presenting him, you know, in this very particular way as a protector of monasteries, almost as a kind of king abbot figure. It seems very likely that the second coronation ordo was composed by Ethelwald. We don't know for certain, but it bears a lot of his stylistic hallmarks. There is a separate, for the first time we see a separate coronation rite composed for the Queen. And again, it's very hard to resist the temptation to see this as a coronation rite for Queen Elfrith, Edgar's wife. And this ordo becomes the basis for modern coronation ordinays. So I think what we're seeing here is we're having this second coronation in an imperial context with this new coronation ordo written by the same man that's, I would argue, who has written this consolidated or steered this consolidated monastic rule. I think it's a representation of a reshaping of Edgar's kingship in a much more explicitly monastic way. And I've said here, and this is very provocative, and my historian friends will probably shoot me down for saying this, is it the Benedictinization of English kingship? Is that what's going on between, let's say, 966 and 973, and this imperial coronation with its new liturgy is the kind of, if setting the seal on this new kind of English kingship, a much more explicitly spiritual kingship, one that has strong penitential aspects, and one where the king is very explicitly a kind of an abbot stroke shepherd figure. And I want to go back to this image of Edgar that I showed you a few slides earlier. You know, I would say it's very hard to the one thing we can say about Winchester art of the late 10th century, of which this is the best example, is they hadn't quite got physical anatomy down right. It's hard to work out whether Edgar is meant to be standing or lying. I would argue that he's prostrate for two reasons. One is I think his pose indicates that this is a king prostrate before Christ, but with his hands and his head uplifted. But also on the page opposite it is a Latin couplet: Sic celso residet solio qui condidit astra, rex venerans eadgar pronus adorat eum. Thus he who established the stars sits on a lofty throne. King Edgar, pronus, prostrate, venerates and adores him. So this idea of earthly royal power prostrate before heavenly power, I think, is what's being articulated here in this image of Edgar. And we start to see the language of penance and penitential behavior creep into royal documents in Edgar's reign, but especially in the reign of his much less fortunate son, Ethelred the Unready. I can talk about Ethelred in the Q&A, but let's move on. So kingship, yes, this is changing kingship, but also I think it's changing the relationship between lay and monastic society. So there's a kind of not paradox, maybe a dichotomy here, or tension. A tension is what I'm looking for. So one of the aims of the reform movement is to remove secular control of monasteries from lay hands, so from the hands of local elites. But these reformed houses also had very close relationships with elite families. Reform depended not just on royal support, but on the support of local aristocrats and local bigwigs. And I've got a list here of laymen who found or refound monastic houses explicitly as Benedictine houses in the late 10th century. Ethelwyn, sometimes known as Amicus Dei, friend of God, Ramsey Abbey, Ealdorman Bertnoth. Those of you who did English, Old English as undergraduates might have looked at the Battle of Maldon poem, which celebrates Ealdorman Bertnoth's heroic death. A classic bit of English celebrating heroic defeats. But he's very closely connected to Ely. A man I've worked on in the past, a man called Wulfrich Spot, who refounded Burton Abbey in the North Midlands, and yada, 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 on and on. So there's lay individuals, mostly laymen, but it's also some lay women, the foundress of what becomes Wolverhampton Priory. Wulfrun is an aristocratic woman, probably the mother of Wulfrich Spot. So these reformed houses end up at the centre of networks of lay patronage and benefaction, lay gift giving, lay relationships, lay people entering into confraternity with the monks. And we have texts that kind of spell this out for us. There's two I've noted here, the Libellus Athelwoldi and the Librariensis, both detail a very close relationship between these houses and the local aristocracy. The image here is from a text known as the Newminster Liber Vitae, and this is literally Book of Life. These are names of people who've entered into confraternity with the monks of the New Minster. And you can see it's kind of there's an original 2 columns of names, and then lots of names are written around them in all sorts of spaces. This is a living book of confraternity. But I think it's a two-way street. It's not just lay people giving to monasteries. It's also, to an extent, I think, monastic values impacting on lay society, ideas around penance, ideas around what is a good life to lead, ideas around obedience. One of the most important writers of the late 10th century is a man called Elfrich, who was spent much of his career at Ensham in Oxfordshire before becoming abbot of Cairn in Dorset. But he is well known as a homiliarist, he said. And most of his homilies are for other churchmen, but there's a number of homilies for lay people. And one I've mentioned here is a homily for an Oxfordshire layman, a local lord called Sigurd of Astall. And it's clear that Sigurd has written to Elfrich and said, look, how do I live a good life? How do I square being a secular man and living a good Christian life? And Elfrich writes a homily to Sigurd, talking about how one squares that circle. So I think we can sort of see them, to an extent, the monasticization of lay society in England after Edgar's, or during and after Edgar's reign. So why does this actually matter? I find this endlessly fascinating, but by now most of my students will have zoned out. I'm hoping no one here is zoned out. Why does this matter? Well, I think it matters for a number of reasons. First is that Edgar's reign becomes, later on, seen as a golden age. It becomes a kind of, we all have golden ages, or all societies have a golden age, where we look back and think, that's it, things were much better then, And Edgar's reign becomes that golden age for the 11th and 12th centuries. So his reign, he's followed by Ethelred the Unready. Ethelred the Unready's reign ends in disaster. Ethelred is deposed in 1014 by the Danish king Sven Forkbeard. He returns from exile but dies in 1016, and England is conquered by Sven's son Knut. Now, Knut, on the one hand, Knut is a conquering king. On the other hand, he wants to demonstrate continuity, but he doesn't look to Ethelred, he looks to Edgar. So Knut explicitly picks on Edgar as the king that he imitates, whose laws that he follows, partly to legitimize himself and partly to damn the memory of his predecessor. Look, I'm not looking at Ethelred because Ethelred was rubbish. I'm looking at his predecessor, who was a good king. And that image gets taken up in the 12th century. So those saints' lives I mentioned earlier in the talk about St Dunstan, St Ethelwald and St Oswald that are written in the late 10th century kind of as propaganda almost for their endeavours, then gets picked up in the late 11th and 12th century by other writers. I've mentioned them here: Eadmer, William of Malmesbury, Henry of Huntingdon. So they construct in the 12th century, they construct the 10th century as a kind of golden age. Then it all went wrong. So we need to get back to this golden age of King Edgar. But also we see the way that the conquering Norman king, so as you all know, hopefully you all know, in 1066, England is conquered by Normans, by the Dukes of Normandy and their followers. And of course, the one thing about the Dukes of Normandy is they're not kings. When they land, they're not kings. They need to kind of learn how to be kings. They need to perform being kings. And the king they look to is Edgar. So they take Edgar and Edgar's model of kingship, and that's the model of kingship that they develop. So the way that power is performed after the Norman Conquest essentially looks back to the 10th century. Again, it's a way of delegitimizing their immediate predecessors. Saying, well, these are kings who were corrupt and venal and had, who had fallen away from the proper path. But Edgar is our touchstone. So Edgar becomes the model for Norman and Anglo-Norman and Angevin kings. So the model of kingship, I would argue, this is why I think it matters. The model of kingship that is developed by Edgar and his monastic associates, by Dunstan, by Ethelwald, by Oswald, becomes hardwired into the way that English kingship appears and operates across what we call the Central Middle Ages. So in other words, the point at which the English kingdom really comes into being as we understand it today, and its relationship with the rest of Britain and Ireland is kind of fixed up until the 20th century. The model of kingship that's being kind of developed is one ultimately that has its roots in King Edgar's reign. The importance of ritual, the importance of counsel. This is something, I mean, listen. A good king is a king who listens. He'll make his own decisions, but a good king is a king who listens. And the king as a shepherd, the king whose actions have a material impact on the spiritual well-being of the people. This is what runs through the period up to 1300 and probably beyond, but I'll stop in 1300. So that's why I think this matters. That's why I think we can talk about the rule as being a kind of foundational text in the way that the English kingdom comes into being in the 10th century, hardwired into the way that these people, Ethelwald, Oswald, Dunstan, Edgar, shape kingship. At the heart of that is the rule and the consolidated English rule. And that, I think, is where I'll stop. I've banged on long enough. Thank you for listening. Shall I stop? No, I need to
stop sharing. Yeah.
Don't share yet.
Stop sharing. Down the bottom, it's that little red thing at the bottom. That's it. Brilliant. Well, I can see a few people clapping and thanking you. That was a really, really spectacular talk. And you've awoken, I think, so much interest, certainly in me, to this period of the 10th century. It's amazing. So I'm going to throw this open now to questions. We've got 10 minutes for questions. So please, what I'm going to ask you to do is there is a little button down the bottom, which is called the React button. And if you press on it, then there's a raise hand. Did you see I just raised my hand? So that's probably the best way to ask a question. If that tech is too much, just put your hand up and I'll try and catch you for a question. So we have our first question, and that's from Mike. So over to you, Mike.
I think there was someone in front of me, actually.
Father Leo?
I saw a hand.
Well, you go first, Mike.
Okay. And it just struck me as you were talking there, Johnny. I never thought about it before, but could there have been any correlation with King David? Was there any sense of looking in his direction in terms
Yes, definitely. Though, so the first thing that springs to my mind is there's a very close relationship between 10th century English kings and the people who are ruling what we now think of as Germany, so the dynasty that historians call the Ottonians. And we have, amazingly, in the Schatzkammer in Vienna, we have the crown of Otto the Great, which is a series of beautiful gilded plates that run around the head, and the plate on the front is King David.
Oh.
So absolutely. I mean, and if we look at the introduction to Alfred the Great's law code, Great Law Code, the preface is a long meditation on Mosaic law, and then a discussion of Solomon and David. So there's a kind of triumvirate that informs the way, or an Old Testament triumvirate that informs the way that kingship is kind of thought of in the 9th and 10th centuries. David is the war leader, Moses is the lawgiver, and Solomon is the wise judge. And that kind of triumvirate is sort of encapsulated, or ideally a early medieval king encapsulates that triumvirate. So David is hugely important for all of his flaws.
Yeah. And the king could sin and then would need to make reparation.
Yes, I mean, Edgar's really interesting, because one question I was asked last year was why don't we cult Edgar? Why is there no attempt to? Because he's very closely connected to important monastic founders. He's surrounded by saints. Why isn't there an attempt to cult him? And one argument is, well, because actually his personal life is quite checkered. That he, as a king, Elfrith, Queen Elfrith, is probably his third wife. He has a son by an earlier marriage, and I'm trying to think. It's most of the commentary on Edgar in the 12th century is very complimentary, but there is a hint, I think, in Roger of Howden that he had a penchant for nuns. So, yeah, I think Edgar certainly is a king who sinned, but also clearly did penance for it, I suspect. So yes, I think kings could sin, but kings could also be redeemed.
Great. Let's go to Father Leo.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Oh, good. Yes, I was delighted by this presentation, and I was contrasting it in my mind with David Starkey saying that the British Constitution has very little to do with Christianity, and it's really much more to do with the classical world, which I think is very unlikely. And one of the things that strikes me is how Westminster is based around Westminster Abbey very closely. And in Scotland, it's based around Holyrood and the Augustinian canons. And the influence of the rule and the idea of careful consultation, even of the youngest, seems to me a key political idea, really. And then the whole model of the king as shepherd and abbot is very rich. And because I lived at Downside near Bath, I was struck by how if you go to Wells Cathedral, it's full of, and of course Wells and Bath were closely linked, it's full of all this royal imagery. And I don't know whether there's any connection, but of course the Bishop of Bath and Wells stands next to the throne at the coronation still. Anyhow, it's not really a question, but it's just a
No,
thanks.
I mean, I don't know. This is my chance to give David Starkey a bit of a kicking. I mean, David Starkey is a great Tudor historian. He knows very little about early medieval English history, other than what he got from Stenton, which was written in 1943. So, no, I think you're absolutely right, and I think Bath is. I think this is why that coronation in Bath in 973 is so important, because it is this kind of, Bath itself is important. Its bishop, or the bishops at that point are bishops of Wells, is important. That I hadn't thought about why the Bishop of Bath is, well, the Bishop of Bath and Wells is standing next to the king, but that might be why. Is going back to that 973 coronation. But I think as I said in my conclusion, that at the heart of the way English kingship is being developed at the end of the 10th century and then picked up again at the end of the 11th into the 12th century is this sense in, this essentially the rule, I would argue. Or certainly the rule has a very strong influence on the way, the idea of what a king should be and how a king should behave. And, is the kingdom a kind of, a sort of a monastic community writ large? I think is one of the things that's being kind of articulated in those texts from the 960s and 970s.
Let's move to Catherine. You need to unmute, Catherine. You need to unmute.
Here I am. Hello, good evening. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I'm quite new to this, so my question is steeped in kind of a not knowing, but I'm very interested in this idea of how you began at the beginning with this picture of our current king, Charles III. And I just wondered whether you see today, or in our last Queen, the flavors of this Benedictine principle being lived out? I recently read Rowan Williams' book on the way of St Benedict, and he talks very much of encouraging these Benedictine principles in daily life, in our lives today. And I'm wondering whether you see it in the way in which kings, queens, contemporary kings and queens think of their kingship and queenship.
That's a really, really good and interesting question. So I think we're used to the idea that the monarchy today it's a largely ceremonial institution, has been for a couple of hundred years at least. But I think the one thing, I mean, we're too early into King Charles's reign to really be able to judge, I think. But the one thing I would say, and I'm not a diehard monarchist by any stretch, but I think the one thing above all else that you could say about Queen Elizabeth II was hers was a life of service. You know, and sometimes quite hard service. So I think, and service is at the heart of what we do in a way. So I think that's where I'd see the kind of, and the notion that the king is also a servant, and I think that is there in, the king as shepherd, king as servant. I think is there in the 10th century text. I think it's there right the way through. The way that the kind of what we call the kind of ideology of monarchy as an institution, if it has any function, it is is to serve.
Thank you. So we'll move to James now. We've got time for 2 more questions, James and then Paul, and then we'll wrap up.
I'll try and be quick. I've got an observation and then a question. The observation is that back in the 1980s, I was being trained to be an officer of the Territorial Army. And the British Army's ethos of leadership is that of listening and shepherding. As the officer in charge of a platoon, you are there, you're meant to listen to the people that you're leading. Yes, as you said, you take the decision, but you are also the shepherd. You are responsible for their physical, spiritual, mental welfare. And so I don't think this is something that just restricts itself to the monarch. I think that if you look at this model of service in society from our social leaders, if you like, it goes straight the way through. So that's the observation. And the question is hopefully a much simpler one. Was there any other model of monasticism available to Edgar and Ethelwald other than Benedictines?
Okay, so the last question, or the question first. In terms of a rule that you could take and use, probably not. I mean, early European, Western European monasticism had a number of flavors, but they're all broadly based along the lines of articulated by Benedict of Nursia in the 6th century, but adapted to local environments. So in terms of a rule you could pick up, I suppose the only other rules, I mean, there are rules for canons to live. There are communal rules. So the rule of a man called Chrodegang of Metz, who none of you will have heard of. I can guarantee there are no devotees of Chrodegang of Metz in this room or on this screen, and I'd be amazed if you are a devotee of Chrodegang of Metz. Please make yourself known. So there are other rules for other kinds of clerical life, but monastic, I think, yeah. The Rule of St Benedict. But your observation, I think, is really important, because someone I've not talked about, because he was a generation later than the people I was talking about, a man called Archbishop Wulfstan of York, who writes in the early, he's probably the man that drafts Canute's legislation, but he writes about Christian society. He writes a number of texts, the Institutes of Polity, a text in Old English. And he's very clear about the importance, the model of behaviour set by secular leaders, but not kings, so by aldermen and by reeves, and what they should be doing, and how they should behave in relation to the people they're responsible for. So I think, yeah, it's not simply confined to kings. This is a model of I mean, loosely speaking, I'd call it lordship in the context of the way that 10th century people would understood it, but leadership, I think, is probably the modern way of thinking about it. A model of leadership that works down the social scale.
Thank you. And now for our last question, Paul. I'm assuming it's you, Paul.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, Charlie. Well, first of all, just with regard to what the last speaker was saying, I completely agree about the sort of ethic that prevails, certainly within the army anyway, from my experience. There's very much one of service. I think that's taken from the monarch who commissions you, and I mean, I really feel that is it's properly executed. It's very strong anyway within the officer, the core within the army, is serving the soldiers that you're leading and looking after. Anyway, I was wanting to just reflect briefly. I mean, I'm not an historian, and I don't know whether this is the case, but apart from the Protectorate in the 17th century, is it the most enduring monarchy in Europe? The English monarchy, and could that be perhaps largely because of the fact that it's about service, and that's what ultimately, I mean, with obviously important exceptions, sort of endears it to the people?
Gosh, that's a good question. Is it the most enduring monarchy in Europe? I think now it is. So the countries in Europe that have monarchies as well have not had them since the 10th century. I mean, the Scots have had a monarchy since, there is an identifiable thing north of Hadrian's Wall that we might want to call the Kingdom of the Scots from the 9th century, that endures until the Union of the Crowns in 1707. So in that respect, you could argue the Scottish monarchy is as old, if not a wee bit older. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I could be cheeky and say, well, actually, it endures because Britain is an island.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
And I guess we got our revolution out of the way quite early in the 17th century.
Yeah.
But that's
they were good penitents.
It's a really good question.
Henry II was a good penitent, wasn't he? Even Henry VIII did his penance.
Okay. Well, listen,
thank you very much.
Thank you for answering all those questions. So Charlie, the overall brief of this year's St. Benedict week was to look at St. Benedict, patron of Europe, 60 years ago, declared by Pope Paul VI, and to look at his relevance in today. And I just feel that you have established the relevance from deep back in our past. I see 3 L's. I see leadership, our model of leadership. I think, like many people, I was astonished when I saw the liturgy of King Charles III being crowned, and to hear about how that goes back to 973 is very enlightening. And the last thing is listening as well. This whole notion that deep in our constitution, deep in our history, is that importance which we can trace back to the Rule of St Benedict. So, Charlie, on behalf of us all, can I give you a big thank you? Can we all just give Charlie very worthy thanks and say thank you? Now, the recording will be made available, and so do pass on the message if you want other people to hear it. And I'm just going to end off with a couple of adverts. So next Monday, we're going to hear from Baroness Sheila Hollins, who's a long-term member of the community and who's going to be talking about lay involvement with the Rule of St Benedict. And there she is in the House of Lords dealing with such important issues at the moment. She's going to be talking to us about lay people living this vision of peace and love in family and politics and care. So do come along. Then on next Saturday, if you are keen and you don't mind getting on a bus from Hancross to go to Worth Abbey, because there's going to be very little parking there, do come along to Worth Abbey for the 50th anniversary of the consecration of the church. And our third talk speaker is Abbot Primate Jeremias Schroeder, who's going to be talking about the relevance of the Rules of St Benedict as well. He's going to be talking about it. And then one of our aims with St. Benedict Week is to get people to engage with their local monastery and to go and find someone to go and pray with. So we've done a map which we'll be sharing with you, which shows 29 different monasteries, Anglican and Catholic, all Benedictine, in the UK and Ireland. So if you get the chance during St. Benedict Week, we're inviting you to go and pray with those monks. And lastly, we have a new publication which Mike Woodward has piloted, which was a book written by Father Stephen Ortiger, but beautifully finished off by Mike, and it's going to be published next week. It's The Life and Times of Abbot Victor Farwell, and copies will be available. Where will they be available, Mike?
At the Worth Abbey Bookshop would be an excellent place to find them.
Great, and so highly to be recommended. Anyone who knew Abbot Victor will know that this will be a very rich and inspiring book to read. And of course, Father Stephen writing this book, he wrote that before he passed away 18 months ago.
Can I just bring attention to, on the right, the booklet on prayer, which is a distillation of Abbot Victor's much longer talk from 1971, which I think could be really, really helpful to people who want to pray more.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And if anyone cannot get to a monastery and wants to pray in a monastic style, then come and join us online. We pray the office twice a day, 3 times a day. We do Lauds, Vespers, and Compline. We also do early morning prayer. You're very welcome to join us. So with that, thank you very much.